Let me tell you one other thing about why that became so important to me is because I've been on the receiving end of that when I was coming up, and it was a gift, right? Straight talk is a gift. What I say to people all the time is that people that really care about you will tell you the truth, and people that don't will watch you make the same mistake over and over for their own entertainment, right?
Yes.
They'll tell everybody but you, right?
Hi, I'm Lorne Rubis, the host of Culture Talks, where we talk to and meet emerging next gen leaders that are solving the world's biggest problems and also creating much better workplaces. And today, I'm so delighted to let you know that we have the wonderful, remarkable Beverley Wright with us, who is the CEO and founder of Wright Choice. She is just a impact coach and leader around the country and even beyond that. She's on the board of the Unreasonable Group, and I had a chance to meet Beverly there as we are also both mentors of the Unreasonable Group. I'll tell you a little bit more, but I just want to say hello, Beverly, and where are you planted today? Where are you situated? And I love the beautiful background you have. Where are you today?
Well, today I am calling from my home in Plano, Texas, which is a suburb of Dallas, and excited to be here and to have this conversation and really just to hang out with you for a little while.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's I'll just say a little bit more if you check out Beverly on LinkedIn. Like, I mean, you've got 17 mega experiences there listed, and long-term IBM executive, and most of your focus has really been around leadership advancement, right? And helping leaders of particularly in the C-suite, but at every level, kind of advance their lives. You talk about the importance of return on people in addition to return on investment. It's just, we share a common purpose and passion of. And so our audience are mostly people that they're ever continual learners, and they jump into our podcast and try to get insights around their own personal growth and development, of course. And so as you've hung around as a mentor to the Unreasonable Group Fellows, and there are about, I don't know, 400, 500 of these founders of incredible companies, and you're on the board, but you've been around them for some period of time now. As you've observed the ones that have emerged more and have been able to scale and become more effective, what have been some attributes, leadership attributes that you've noticed that are sort of common amongst that, very diverse group of leaders? What struck you about the ones that have really found a way forward?
Well, the ones that I have been just really impressed with are the ones that are just have palpable passion for what they're doing. They are so committed to it. They can see it, taste it, feel it, even when things get rough. I think the passion and the impact that they think what they're doing will have, positive impact, is what drives them forward. I know for one that I'm working with right now, making some connections for him. He is just so excited about what he's doing. He is relentless in pursuing the resources that he needs to take him to the next level. And what he's doing is a little different than what many of the others are doing. And that doesn't seem to bother him at all. And so I finally made the connection where we're now trying to schedule because he has a book he wants to publish in addition to the other things that he's doing. And I had somebody that I thought would be a good person for him to talk to that's been in the publishing game at a very high level for a long time. So I think the commitment, I think their vision and the hope that they have for the difference what they're doing will make in the world. That's the other too, is that they clearly can see it even when others can't. And that's what's attractive because they can pull people in that can support them and, maybe add some additional insight for them. And so that's to me is the difference maker between the ones that'll be there for the long haul and others that might peter out before it's over.
Devin, I've looked at your work and I see the word passion quite a bit. It's woven in through much of your advice and counsel and perspective. And a lot of times, if you ask people, "Are you passionate?" they put their hand up and say, "Well, I'm passionate." But it's such a continuum. Like, what would be sort of indications when you go, you really know it's there? It's more than a stated intent. you can see the behavior? What do you look for?
I look for people that are clear about at least what they want to accomplish, right? They've put some guardrails around it. They've challenged themselves. They've been open sometimes to hearing how other people see their passion or what they need to do. They're on a mission. They've kind of decided what their assignment is, and they are relentless in pursuing that. So they don't give up at the first sign of struggle, right?
Yeah.
But if you're going to be an entrepreneur, if you look entrepreneur up in the dictionary, struggle is probably one of the things that is in that definition somewhere in a very prominent place. And my parents were entrepreneurs. And so I grew up seeing what they did to have their passion support us as a family. And I never thought it was something that I would do, but I think I had it in my blood, and I certainly see it in the people that we run into, not just in unreasonable, but I saw it in my corporate life as well. Is that we had a passion at the time that I was in my company. We had a passion for winning and for taking care of our clients and for having a healthy work culture, which I think is in some ways under attack and that
I,
current.
I want to come back to that. I agree. It's under attack. I want to explore that with you. But before we do, though, I love the fact that you've been so inspired around this passion from your mom and dad. Can you dig into that a little bit more, Bev? What were they like?
They were, you know what? I just wrote something last night in a group that I'm a part of, and we were talking about the examples that we had. And so my mom and dad were people that grew up in the country. I'm a product of Dallas. I was born and raised in Dallas, but my parents were from East Texas, from Nacogdoches, where Stephen F. Austin College is, and that kind of thing. And so I saw them. My dad was a former Army person, but when he came back from the Army, he never really wanted to work for anybody else. And so he became a barber, and over time convinced my mother to go to barber and beauty school. And so they had a barber shop and a beauty shop that were right next to each other that
Oh,
that became a standard in the I run into people today that when I tell them where I grew up and mention Horace's Barber and Beauty Shop, they were like, "You're Mr. Horace's daughter," right? Because it was when one of the things that I saw them do is they used their business to grow the community. So on report card day, they would have kids stop by and show them their report card, and my dad would give them $1 for every A, right?
it's incredible.
And then you had the community side where people that came and didn't always come for a haircut, they came to play dominoes. They had a table in the back, and they had the regulars that came by, and it was community. And so that's how I grew up. And then when my sister and I, it was just the two of us, when we were growing up, they didn't have daycare centers. So when school was out, when we got out midday, my mother would come and pick us up and take us back to the barber shop. We'd be at the barber and beauty shop with them. They had the same barbers and beauticians for most of their life. My dad's brothers, one of his brothers, that's the only job he ever had, was being a barber in the barber shop that his brother started. So it was a community, and we grew up in that community. The barbers knew it. They were our babysitters. If my mother and father had to go get supplies, then they'd say, "Okay, Mr. Sergeant is in charge until we get back." Of me and my sister. And so it was just a wonderful place to grow up. And my dad was the kind of person that would give you the shirt off his back, and many times did. He co signed for way too many cars of people that really weren't trustworthy, right? But he was a deacon in the church. We grew up. My mother was on the usher board. And so these were people. I remember a conversation that I had with my mom about, and I don't remember how we got on the conversation, but one of the things she said to me is that you're not going to see very many burning bushes anymore. So God gives it to you so that you can share it with others. And so you are to be a blessing to other people. So that,
I'm so glad that I could visualize the whole thing, Bev. Like
yeah,
when we're talking about building great cultures, we're talking about your mom and dad's barber and beauty shop,
yeah,
community, together towards a purpose, to advancing other people, to giving our shirts off our backs for the benefit of others, even sometime when we not so sure we should. How
Absolutely.
wonderful is that? Thank you for sharing that. That just that sounds like it ought to be a movie. That is
You know what? I have started because the other thing is that I grew up in the same neighborhood with, and we are still together. So most of the people that I grew up with, we started out in first grade together, and we are still having annual get-togethers. We went to Punta Cana in 2020. There were about 50 of us that were had been together since either first grade or seventh grade. We had two schools come together in seventh grade, and so we got another group of folks. But we have regular meetings all the time and get together, and some of our kids have gone to college together, and so it's just a whole community of people that have known me one way or another. We've known each other since either first grade or seventh grade, including our teachers until they all passed.
wow.
We picked them up. And it changes the way you see creating community, both in business and in your personal life.
And I love the metaphor of creating community and how that does transcend from one's personal life.
Yeah.
You know, with all the, I mean, that's very, with all the individualization and loneliness and the pressure that has caused communities to dismantle, that is counterintuitive to it's what the world needs, but it's we just haven't been in a position to seem to move that way. We seem to be moving apart, not together more. And you know, I'd like to explore this thing about sort of the culture and sort of being under a little bit of attack. You know, if someone came to you, a leader came to you in the C-suite and said, you know, Bev, I've known you for a long time. I know that you know you're a very impactful coach, but let me tell you what my board's telling me. My board's telling me focus on efficiency, focus on short-term results, focus on getting AI into this business, and we don't have any room for anything else on the agenda that has to do with people and culture. So just, you know, focus and get on with it. What would you say to that leader?
I can give you two cases where I've actually had those conversations. One was when I started my business externally while I was still at IBM. And so I was coaching leaders in the evening when I got home, 2 nights, 3 nights a week, actually, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And so I had this leader referred to me by his company. And what they told me is that they had had one of their employees that they really wanted to retain resign and give his name as the reason he was resigning. And so they wanted me to work with him to see if I could help him be able to be a better leader. So the first night that we talked, he came to me and he said, "Well, I know why I'm here." And I said, "Well, why do you think you're here?" And he said, "Well, I was dealing with poor performance and he tried to make me a scapegoat." Right. And so I said, "Well, let me ask you this." I said, "Do you think that you can deal with poor performance without it becoming acrimonious?" And he thought for a moment and he said, "I actually don't." And I said, "Oh, okay, let's start there." When I tell you, Lauren, that this young man, with the work that we did, he turned it around where he's now one of the highest executives in the company. They actually told him he was the future of the company because through our work, he was working on his master's degree too at the same time when we were working. And so one night he came to the meeting and he said, "Oh, I got an A on whatever exam he was taking." And so he thought I was going to say congratulations. And I said, what's important about getting an A? And so he said to me, he said, "You know, every time I know where you're going, you go somewhere else." And he said, "I'm the only black man in my class, and I think I represent all others. And so I feel this pressure to always excel." And so we started talking through that. By the time we got through, he was in tears because he said, "I don't know if I know how to be authentic anymore." Right? And with the work that we did, he quickly moved up through the company. He became the top executive in his field. They even had him take over some of the problem areas because he was a tech guy. And it was for a major hotel company that's very well known. And in short, he became the person that turned so many of their organizations around that were headed in the wrong direction. And he's still now working in education. And it's just been a difference. He stopped eating red meat. He went on a health journey. His daughter now, who was 2 years old when we first started working together, and he was a self described workaholic. So, one of the first things I said to him is, I want you to be home to have, before your daughter goes to bed, at least 3 nights a week. It only took one time. He came home when she was still awake, and she, at 2 years old, was standing at the back door waiting on him.
Wow.
And so now she is in her second year of college. She's going to be a doctor. She works out with him in the mornings. I mean, completely, and they have a son now as well. It changed his whole life. And I asked him, do you think you can be authentic for 1 hour a day? That's where we started. All right. And he's a whole different kind of leader now, just an entirely different kind of leader. Second one works for a major worldwide global company. And we talked while he was on vacation with his family in Colorado. And one of his kids came in while he was talking, and he introduced me to his daughter. What he wanted to talk about is exactly what you said, is he was having private conversations with other leaders of other major companies, and they were saying things that he thought were inappropriate about how they were leveraging the company for their own benefit. And he said, I want to be the best father, the best leader, the best husband that I can be. I need these relationships for my business success, but I'm uncomfortable with some of the private conversations that I'm privy to. And how do I make the balance between staying a part of this group where they're saying things that if they were public would be very inappropriate, and but I need those relationships. And my conversation with him is that part of being a good leader is having to make tough choices about who you
Yeah.
really are. And I said, you don't get to pick and choose what's in the leadership package. Right? It comes as a package. So you don't get to take out the pieces, excuse me, that you don't enjoy. And that's one of those things where you have to look yourself in the mirror and decide what you're going to do. And so he actually left the company that he was working for and went to another company. And so I tell them all the time is that leadership is not for wimps. It's just
Yeah.
not. Right. And I had another client where we did a 360, and everybody was anonymous that replied except the manager. So the person would know what the manager said. And so she had a problem employee, and he definitely was a problem. And he at the time was their diversity, equity, and inclusion leader. And that was a big problem. And so she asked me about the 360. She said, it's all anonymous. And I said, well, it is for everybody except you. And she went, oh, that's a problem. And I told her, I said, well, it's part of the leadership package, right? And
Part of the
they
package.
exactly. You don't get to take the fun parts and leave the challenging parts there. And so she did have to have the conversation with him, and he did need to not be there. He was a big part of the problem. But she really had a hard time having that direct conversation with him. So I said that's a muscle you need to exercise because
Yeah.
it's part of your job.
Those are great stories, Bevan. Now I have a better understanding beyond the obvious around why the company's called the Right Choice, because it's choice and courage and the whole package. You don't get to just pick out the nice fun stuff.
Yeah.
You got to work through the tough and gritty stuff as well, for
Well,
sure.
let me tell you one other thing about why that became so important to me is because I've been on the receiving end of that when I was coming up, and it was a gift, right? Straight talk is a gift. What I say to people all the time is that people that really care about you will tell you the truth, and people that don't will watch you make the same mistake over and over for their own entertainment, right?
Yes.
They'll tell everybody but you, right?
Yeah.
You will be the topic of conversation. And so early in my career, before I went into management, I had a second line manager that was a former Marine. And I had convinced myself that I was about to be promoted to the next level. And I kept, every time they called me into a meeting, I kept thinking, okay, this is when they're going to tell me I'm going to be promoted. And it didn't happen. So I'm talking to my second line manager. And finally, I just decided to say to him, I think I've earned a promotion, blah, blah, blah. And so he, in his, most marine way, he said, "You've done a good job, and but we have somebody that's done a better job, and they're going to get the promotion. And there are a couple of things I want you to work on." When I tell you I was crushed because I was so convinced that I was getting ready to go to this other job. And so I made it out of the office, really sat with it and thought about what he said, and finally said, okay, I need to focus on what he's telling me I need to work on because I can't promote myself. So I've got to make sure that I'm following that. It took me another year to get that promotion, but he was the first person I called. He had moved to a different part of the same company, just a different division. And I called him up and thanked him and said, I want to thank you for being honest with me so that I could focus on what I needed to be doing. And I wanted you to know it took me another year, but I got there. And I started understanding the power and the gift of straight talk when you're doing it for the betterment of the person.
Right.
And when I retired from IBM years later, he had retired many years before that. He lives in Atlanta. I called him when I retired and thanked him again because he had been a wonderful example to me of, someone that cared about me enough to tell me the truth.
That's right. It's such an important reference point and story. Why do we have such difficulty having these crunchy conversations around? Because when you have someone in your life or multiple people in your life that tell you in a caring, loving way what you can't see with our blind spots, and we all have them, many of them.
Absolutely.
They're cherished people in our lives. And so why do we have such a hard time doing that, do you think?
I think it's because we have a challenge trying to figure out how we share it with people and actually have something it's based on that they can understand. So we tend to say, I feel like you're doing X, Y, and Z. Well, they can't do anything with your feelings. So if all you can say is, if you don't have a way to tell them what they need to change or what's working well, they don't have anything with any weight that they can figure out, what do I need to do differently? What am I doing really well? Because most leaders talk about what they feel, and that's the way they think about it too. They don't have evidence that the person can say, okay, I can understand what I need to do now differently because you've given me something I can touch, feel, and hear. I understand the
Something
change.
concrete enough to really act on.
Absolutely. And it's because it's more work for us to come up
Yeah.
with that information. And so, I had an example of someone that was on my team and had always been a good performer, great performer, and something was off. I'm not a micromanager, so I don't, but I could just tell something was off and I didn't know what it was. And so I watched it for a while. And then finally one day I just said to him, "Hey, before you go home, why don't you come by the office? I'd love to touch base with you." And I didn't know what it was. I thought it, many times you think it's work related. Sometimes it's completely not work related. These are humans. They have lives outside of work. And so when he came to talk to me, Lauren, we were there for 3 hours and he came by at the end of the day. So my husband was calling, like, are you coming home? That kind of thing. And it didn't have anything to do with work. It was his marriage. And he had been walking around with this and he just completely unloaded on me by saying that, I want to leave my wife. I can't stand to look at her anymore. I'm not sure why. I want to just her to let me and the boys. And I knew because I got to know my employees on intentionally. I knew that his dad had not been in his life and had abandoned him. And so I said to him, "Do you know the impact that had on you? Would you want to do the same thing to your kids?" All right. And so, long story short, he ended up moving out of the house, but down the street where he could still take them to school and that, and the other. Now, this story has a very surprising ending. So, anyway, they separated, all of those kind of things, thought they were going to get divorced, and they didn't. And so, what happened is he was a young man. He was probably in like his mid 30s or so, found out that he had a serious health problem and he discovered it. And I asked him, I said, "Do you think you were sick when that was going on with your wife and you didn't know it?" He said, Bev, we've talked about that and we do think that was the problem. And so he ended up having to have dialysis, go on dialysis. He
Wow.
had what do you call it when they put it in your heart to keep your heart pumping?
Steps.
Yeah, he had to have that. And so he really was sick. So anyway, they stayed together. She got him a kidney transplant, all of those kind of things. And then after I retired, I heard that they had divorced. So I was really surprised by that. This story ended up on the local news here. He was getting ready to marry another woman. His wife, who was a school teacher that he went through all of this with, she had a heart attack. And he found out about it. He left the woman he was about to ask to marry him, went back to his wife, his former
Oh,
wife. They got remarried and they're married to this day. And so,
no.
but it's one of those things where I thought it was around work that he was having the issue,
Right.
but it wasn't. It was something. And what I tell people, leaders all the time, is that whether you're ready for it or not, the whole person shows up at work.
Person. And that's the whole point of the story. When we don't need someone who punches in from the quote 9 to 5. We lead a whole human being, and we're in a privileged position to do that. I want to just switch gears a little bit to a real world situation that I just had a conversation with yesterday around. Here's a large company, and I was talking to someone who's helping that company with their leadership strategy. And the way that the leadership, and this is not completely, this is a little bit of a slim version of but essentially their leadership development is a catalog of courses. That's their interpretation of what their investment in leadership is.
Yeah.
You got all these classes you can take, and their leadership, and they describe leadership as all these competencies of which there's a taxonomy of them that no one could possibly live up to. So they said, our leadership, we want them to be able to do all of these things. And by the way, here are courses that you can go take to go and do that. And that's our leadership system. Like, how do you advise organizations to go beyond courseware into leadership impact and development and have a true leadership system? What's your advice there?
Well, I will tell you how when I was still in corporate, how we ended up doing that. And I knew who my naysayers were from the very beginning. When I discovered coaching, the way coaching is now, I used to think of coaching as, a sports coach, right? Like a lot of people,
Yeah.
because this was back in the mid 1990s, right? When I discovered coaching. And so I was intrigued by it. I found out about it from a women's luncheon that J.C. Penney's put together. And this woman said she was a coach, and we all said, well, what sport do you coach? And she said, oh, no, I coach ministers, right? And we were like, what? And so I found out about that type of coaching, and I was intrigued by it. And so I went back to work, and I had a full-time job already, but I wanted to learn more about this coaching. And so we had a development process that we had conversations with our manager about where do we want to grow. And so when I met with my manager, I said, I heard about this coaching thing. I'm really intrigued by it. Would you all be willing to pay for me to get training as this type of coach? And it was cheap then because it was the dark ages in coaching. And so she said, yeah, sure, we'd pay for that. And so the thing that turned it around is that there was a course called Coaching Business Teams. And when I took that course, I went to my top exec and said, I need a team to practice on. I do better when I can do hands-on practice. And so long story short, he told me about two teams. One had 12 people, one had 25. And I told him, I said, I don't know what I'm doing yet. I'll take the smaller team. I can, mess up fewer people if I take the smaller team. And so what I didn't know about that team is that they had never made any of their metrics, not any of them, not leads, not sales, not customer service, none of it. But what I saw was that they were very manager centric and they didn't do anything unless the manager said for them to do it, right? They didn't have any accountability from what I could see. And so I worked with the manager who I was already coaching one on one because he was one of the individuals. And so, long story short, we changed everything where the manager was no longer the only person that owned the metrics. I assigned a metric to each one of the salespeople, and they were responsible for understanding that metric and how their individual and collective behavior affected that metric and teaching it to all of there. And so, long story short, they went from the bottom of the group of sales teams that they were part of, reporting to the same exec, to number one. And the salesman, the exec, was somebody that I was coaching individually as well. And when he noticed the change in their results, he went to the team leader and said, what happened to this team? They are now all of a sudden excelling above everybody else. And she said, oh, it's the coaching that we're doing with Bev. So he comes to me, tells me, thank you, blah, blah, blah. He said, I'm going to send a note to the whole executive team to tell them that this may be what we've been looking for, which he did. And actually, our top lead at the time was Canadian. So when he came to town, he scheduled a meeting with me and he said, Bev, why aren't we doing this everywhere? I said, well, it's just me and I have a full time job and I'm kind of
Yeah.
doing it on the side. And he said, well, what would it take for us to replicate you? And so that's how I got the budget to really invest in training. I had my staff trained as the coaches, and then over time, we spread it across the entire corporation with different other locations coming together. There were 30 of us, one in New Zealand, one in China. I mean, so we came together and they all came to Dallas because I had the larger group for our training. And we changed how training was implemented around leadership in particular. And that's how we got the budget to do it. And it lasted long after I retired. But it was them having proof. And some of my naysayers, the people I knew were not going to buy into this, even they, one of them in particular, stood up at a meeting and said, oh, it's just like Bev has been telling us around coaching and the impact it can have when combined with training, that it can make a difference as opposed to just doing the training. And he was one of the people I never, in fact, he even changed his name. We had always called him John, and he said that he was named Jack because his father was John. The only place he was called John was at IBM.
Huh.
And he after all 20 years we had known this man as John. And he started making us call him Jack. When we'd say John, he'd say Jack. And he just did it over and over until we finally got it. So it has an impact that's hard to describe. But what I see now is a very large company when they have a new manager that I was talking to, and I asked her, did they send her to new manager school? And she said, no, they have 80 modules that we're supposed to take in between doing our job. And she said, and I said, well, what if you have an HR situation? Do you have an HR partner that's assigned to you, which used to be standard? And she
Right.
said, we have a button that says ask HR, and we push that. And whoever's on duty that day, this is a major company, picks up, but they don't have any consistency in conversation or the things that used to make a difference. So I think what we have to do is we have to have people somewhere in the company that are willing to build the case to what I used to do is call it a pilot. Pilot became my favorite word. I just didn't tell them that it was going to last until I left. Right. So it lasted for years, but I tell them we're going to pilot this. And then the results from the pilot gave you a credibility to expand it.
Yeah. What you just said is that leadership development is not a module that you take. I mean, that may be part of it. It is a very focused, practical initiative of intentionality in
Absolutely.
order to get better. You can't just say, well, we've got all of our leaders taking a quote communication class and now they're better givers of feedback. There may be a little derivative of that, but I mean, that's just not sufficient in this environment. And I love the idea around maybe that organizations ought to open themselves to sort of lifting up coaching more directly in combination of the actual quote training activity to really make it work.
Well, I used to challenge the leaders that came to me and said, and they would say, I have a leader on my team that needs a coach. And my first question to them would be, who is your coach? How do you
Yeah.
recommend
Well,
something you're not willing to try?
yeah. And I think that's important area of reflection. I'm going to put something on the table which is can be a bit uncomfortable, and I just want to get your perspective. You and I've talked about it before, and we should lend it to our audience. And that's that it's not uncommon these days to hear a leader come in at a senior level and say, You know, I'm all about meritocracy, and I'm letting go of any of my commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. You know, it's not time has passed, and we're just all about meritocracy now. And Bev, I want to get your advice around that. What would you say to that leader?
I have said that. I did a lot of that when I was in my corporate life. One of the things I had one of the our execs call me one day and left me he had an opening for a business unit exec. And he called and gave me two names. He said, "What do you think of those two names for this open position?" And I said to him, I said, "What about," and I called this other guy's name who happened to be a minority. And he's like, "Well, yeah, he would be really." I said, "But you didn't say his name as one of the choices." And what I really came to understand is that we being humans, are really, we are sometimes isolated by our own experiences, right? And if we've not grown up or been exposed to diversity, we don't even recognize what that really means. And so I used to have one on one conversations with our executives about that very topic. I said to one of them, I said, why don't you go out on and talk to your sales leaders? And I said, and ask your white sales leaders how often they've been stopped by the police, just randomly. And I said, and then go and ask the sales leaders you have with similar educations, backgrounds, all of that being very similar, and ask them how often that's happened for them. And I said, I think that will be an education for you about how some things are not equal, no matter how much we want them to be. And you need to be aware of that. And so the other conversation I had with him is that he had created a staff position so that people could go from whatever level they were in, they'd get this broadening experience on staff, and then they'd get to the next executive level. And I watched him put people in those positions, and none of them ever looked like me. And I knew this man to not be racist. I knew it personally because he had taken really good care of me and my career. And so one day I'm in his office, we finish our business conversation. And I said to him, I said, I want to talk to you about something that's probably going to make us both uncomfortable. And I want to know if you want to have that conversation now or should we schedule a separate time? And he said, no, let's talk about it. And so I said to him, I see you creating these positions, and I see you, and I said, I know that for you, it's not about race. I said, I know that. I said, but I'm confused because I never see you put anyone in those positions that help them get to the next level that look like me. And I don't understand it. And I'm hoping that you can help me with that. And so by this time, we're leaning across his desk, whispering, right? And he said to me, he said, you know what, Bev, I don't have a good answer for you. And I should. So don't let me fall asleep on that. And he became one of the people that we really looked at merit, right? And we ended up moving more people of color into those positions that just had not ever been considered. So much so to the point that I went back to him a year later and said, and this is, I think that there should be levity around. We shouldn't be so serious when we talk about things like this. I said to him, I said, well, I didn't mean just Black people, right? I said, I was looking for a little balance, right? I said, so, let's kind of make sure that we're doing the right thing, right? And we did. But it was because I talked about it and I made it comfortable for them to talk to me about it. I had one of my managers come to me and ask me if I thought he was racist because one of his Black employees had accused him of such. But the problem was hers, not his. And I knew that. But we have to be able, again, it's that leadership package. All of these things fit into that package, but we have to be brave enough to have those conversations
Yes,
with the intent of us all getting better, right?
right. I have Susan Scott has that phrase that I often share with people: the conversation is the relationship is the conversation. It is so true, Bev, right? We have to stumble our way. It's clumsy sometimes and uncomfortable, but we have to talk about it and with enough humanness and also levity to understand how human we are around, and we're both opportunities and victims of our own experiences, and unless we expand that, we get stuck into these patterns, and that's, I think we're going to come out at a better place in all this, but it's just I just wanted to talk to you about because I don't want leaders to shy away from. We want to be more diverse. We want more equity and fairness. We want people to be feel included and to belong. And we also want to get great results. We want to get better.
Things are not mutually exclusive. It used to be when I was when I first kind of started out in coaching, I had someone refer someone to me, and it was always interesting because they speak in codes. So she called me and she said, "Well, I have a client in Dallas, and they really want a diverse." She said they want a diverse coach. That's they want a diverse coach. So I always knew that they meant black, right? And she said, "But I hope that they're not," she said, "I hope it's not more important for them to have someone of color than to have a good coach." And I said, "Well, interestingly enough, I don't see those two things as mutually exclusive." I said, "So I'm wondering why you do. I just assume they still want a good coach, right?" And so it surprised her. But I wanted to be able to have those honest conversations
Yeah.
because those are the things that's when we all get the opportunity to grow, and we shouldn't be so sensitive about where people feel like they can't ask us or say the tough things, right? So, I had a conversation as well. We had a guy that was one of our execs, and his dad taught at Brigham Young. And all of a sudden we started having this influx from Utah of reps that he was hiring for his team from Utah, right? And so his manager asked me one day, what was I hearing? And that was something I got a common question about because they knew I would tell them, right? And
Yeah.
so I said there's a lot of chatter on the floor about, having so many people from Brigham Young, blah, blah, blah. And so now he apparently goes and tells this leader that I said that. So I'm having a conversation with him about business. We had a business agenda. And all of a sudden he said, "Well, Bev, I am sick of you telling people that only Mormons get ahead on my team." And I was shocked by it because I was asked this by his boss. It wasn't like I just went in and said, "Let me tell you about blah, blah, such and such." And so he said to me, he said, I'm tired of, I'm hearing that you're telling. And so I said to him, I said, I'm disappointed in the way you heard it, but yes, I did say it. And yes, it's true. And I said, so it is a conversation. I always try to not say anything in private that I wouldn't say about you, that I wouldn't say to you in person. And so, yes, I said it, and it is a conversation. And at the end of now I never did say to him, your boss asked me that question. It wasn't something I came up with. But what he said to me at the end, he said, "Beth, what I want is for every month for you and I to have a conversation and for you to tell me what I need to know." And we had a great relationship.
Thank you for that story. As we move to kind of a close here, we have a lot of these emerging leaders that are going to listen to this. And if one of them asked you and said, look, I'm a continuous learner and but I want to get the benefit of all your wisdom, your wisdom. And so if you were to, and I know there's no simple answer to this, but if you were to summarize how I might be a more authentic, passionate, impactful leader, what would be a couple of things that you would just want me to be acutely aware of, self-aware of? What might they be?
I would say that any and everything you can do as a leader that lets you support and invest in your people, that you will have a successful team. You will have a successful outcome in business because they will run through fire for you if they know you care about them and they aren't just widgets that one of the folks on my team, when I was in corporate, she asked me in a public setting where I was a speaker, and she said, "Bev, I always noticed that when you talk about us, you say we work together. They don't work for me, right? Because I don't pay their salary. And even if they did, they work to support their families and to have a good, they work because they need to, right? And so I always see it as, and I used to say to them, I'm just another member of the team. I have a different role. I may have more impact, but I am a team member. And if I'm doing anything to make your job harder, assume that I don't know it and come tell me. And we'll have those honest conversations. And that was one of the things I insisted on. I used to tell them, I said, some days you wake up and you just don't want to deal with other humans. You don't have a good reason for it. You just done. And I said, but I don't want you to have to call and say you're sick if you're not. Tell me you need a day. You've got your work covered. I said, that's the only thing I require is that nothing falls through the cracks. And as a team, we ought to be able, excuse me, we ought to be able to cover each other, right?
Yeah.
But we insisted, we had a code of conduct that we created together. And one of the things said, protect our team brand, right? And we were all responsible for that. It wasn't
I,
just on
I
me.
love that. Protect the team brand. I love that.
And so,
That is,
I tell leaders that they need to be leaders in the sense that they care about their people and their people know they care about them, and that they are invested in the success of every single team member.
yeah.
Because that's the way we win repeatedly, over and over and over. And sometimes they would come to my office and they said, Bev, I need you to take your management hat off and put your coach hat on. And that means they could tell me things that maybe they wouldn't tell their manager. And I could hold those two things and talk to them from that place that they needed and not just the manager place.
What a great, great message to conclude on. Your mom and dad would be so proud of your continuing to build community
Thank you.
and in a much broader way. And I want to thank you for just bringing your thoughts and your wisdom. And I love talk. We could talk to you for the rest of the day.
Yes.
I hope I
Right.
have a chance to catch up with you at Unreasonable in October if you're going to be there. And hope you get on your feet faster. And thank you for everything. We're cherish this conversation and have just thanks so much, Bev. And we'll talk to you soon.
Okay, well, let me just tell you this one thing is the one of my favorite things is the Chinese quote about, if you want 1 year of prosperity, grow grain. If you want 10 years of prosperity, grow trees. If you want 100 years of prosperity, grow people.
Love that. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
that.
I
Thank
enjoyed
you,
it.
Bev. All right, great. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.